Let's get started, and we let people stream in. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Fall 2021 iSEE Congress. Thanks for joining this webinar today, which is part of our iSEE Congress this year on circular food systems. I'm Madhu Khanna, the Interim Director at the Institute for Sustainability, Energy and Environment, or iSEE for short. I'll just give you a couple of, just a brief background on iSEE. Our institute was formed in December of 2013 and has a threefold mission: funding and shepherding interdisciplinary and actionable research projects that have an impact on solving global grand challenges related to sustainability, energy, and the environment; leading efforts to make the UFI campus a leading model of sustainability, energy efficiency, and environmental friendliness; and preparing students to have an interdisciplinary perspective of sustainability and to be leaders in this field. This is the 8th Congress that we're hosting since 2014. These congresses are intended to facilitate discourse on grand challenges that we face and to bring together leading scholars from multiple disciplines to present the latest scientific understanding on this issue and areas for future research. In particular, agricultural and food systems face a grand challenge of raising productivity while reducing their environmental footprint and adapting to a changing climate. Our current systems can be described as being mostly linear, in that they emphasize production, distribution, and use of food and agricultural products, but do not consider the waste that is being generated and the loss of natural resources or their impacts. An alternative to current systems is a transition into resilient circular economy systems. A circular food system has several features in that it would design out waste and pollution, it would keep products and materials in use, regenerate natural systems, and it must generate economic rewards for transitioning from a linear system. Making these systems circular requires transformative changes through the supply chain, from production to consumption, through technological, market, and policy solutions. And so that is the topic of our Congress this year. We are doing this virtually and through a series of one-hour events in October and November. We will be diving deeper into these topics and discuss advancing the sustainability of our farm and food systems while continuing to increase agricultural productivity. We are thrilled to be able to host discussions about more sustainable approaches, even though this is a virtual format. And we're hoping for an interactive discussion after our two speakers have given their remarks. So please feel free to post your questions as they occur in the Zoom Q&A, and we will take time with our speakers to address as many as we can. The focus of today's talks are going to be on the emerging technologies that can help make agriculture more productive, more effective, and less taxing on our environment. And there's going to be follow-up talks in the coming weeks that are going to focus on how we can transform our food systems, reduce waste, and turn agricultural waste into usable products. For now, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Luis Rodríguez. Luis is the Associate Director for Education and Outreach in iSEE, and he will be introducing our speakers today and moderating the session. Luis.
Thank you, Madhu, and welcome once again to everyone to this first session of the iSEE Congress. I'll go through a short introduction for each of the speakers in turn. They'll make their presentations and we'll move to the other presentations and then Q&A. It'll be my pleasure to introduce these speakers. I'd most of all like to encourage everyone to post their questions to the Q&A, post early and often, so that we can have a nice discussion afterwards. So first and foremost, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ken Cassman, who is the Robert B. Daugherty Emeritus Professor of Agronomy from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. Over a 40-year career, his research has focused on ensuring local and global food security while conserving natural resources and protecting the environment. He has worked on many of the world's most major cropping systems, from rice-based systems in the tropics of Asia and South America to maize and soybean systems in the US, Brazil, Argentina, and high-value irrigated crops in California, Peru, and Egypt. I understand he's joining us from California right now. He currently works at the intersection of agriculture and environmental advocacy to improve yields, profit, and environmental performance. Dr. Cassman has also led the development of the Global Yield Gap Atlas. It's an interactive map, a web-based platform developed to estimate exploitable gaps in yield and water productivity for major food crops worldwide. He's a co-author of Crop Ecology. It's a seminal upper division graduate school textbook. And in 2017, he received the Bertebos Prize from the Swedish Royal Academy of Agriculture and Forestry in recognition of his contributions. So Dr. Cassman, if you're ready, please share your screen and we can dig into your presentation.
Great. Thanks very much, Luis. Today, I do want to talk about something that's a little bit to the side of what you might consider a major discussion about circular agricultural economy and dealing with climate change. But at the end of the day, it's fundamental to that goal. And it's about public goods, big data, and robust metrics to guide our transition to sustainable food systems. And so we start with the challenge, and it's immense. It's food security for 9 to 10 billion people by mid-century, perhaps 11 billion by end of the century. Has to be, by food security, you mean accessible, affordable, adequate nutrition. And I want to add, not just to survive like amoebas on a petri dish, but to flourish. Sometimes I think these discussions are about how little we can consume, rather than seeing food as the fundamental right and center of culture. Food systems that protect the environment are also required, and that's improving soil quality, conserving natural resources, mitigating, adapting to climate change, and contributing to economic development and vibrant societies. But I'd like to add one more fundamental plank in this challenge that we don't talk about enough, and that is we've got to reach zero population growth also by mid-century. And the challenge here is that, yeah, although population growth rates are slowing, population is projected to grow by, and this is the median projection of the UN population division, it's going to be 9.6 billion by mid-century, and again, 11 billion by the end of the century. By the way, these projections are quite robust. If you go back in time, they've been very, very accurate. Now, also not discussed much is the size of the investment that's going to be required. Not only public, but private sector investment. And it's infrastructure, not just energy systems, but infrastructures, waterways, roads, bridges that move food, health, education, and of course the food system itself. Now, the challenge is we don't have unlimited resources. And what you see in the current dialogue about the legislation in Congress about what to fund in a Build Back Better system, it's all horse trading, but amongst priorities. And so fundamental to this is seeing clearly which horses, if you're like a horse race, which horses are most likely to win, and you want to bet on the winners because you don't have enough money to bet on everything. There's also another dimension, and that's a time frame. That is, those of you that have worked in agriculture know that from the time a new idea arises about a new technology or genotype, there's a 10 to 15 time year before you can bring it often to a stage of widespread testing or adoption. And in the case of climate change, if we don't have these technologies on board ready to test at scale, not in small plots, I'm talking in farmers' fields, we will not have them ready to address climate change and meet the challenge of zero carbon emissions by mid-century. We also need then to be able to monitor progress towards those goals, because you're going to have to hold research programs you're funding accountable for reaching those milestones. You can't afford to fund things at large costs. We're talking enormous costs, and go 10 years down the road and find out they're not on track. Now, we've proposed a research framework to do this, and I'll call your attention to a recent paper published in Nature Sustainability, shown at the bottom there. but it has 4 components. So you rank all ideas in terms of the potential magnitude of impact based on these agreed upon metrics. Metrics that indicate clearly adaptation or mitigation of climate change. The second component is time required to have that new technology. And I call it to the testing point. And that's not testing in a small plot. That means ready to go on hundreds and thousands of farmers' fields to see if it really works. And something, and some thought, given how much time and expense it will take to measure whether the technologies are providing the putative benefits that justify the original funding. The third component is the amount of investment. Some things will cost much more money to get done than others. And finally, the probability of success in producing the technology. Research is not certain. It wouldn't be research if it was. So that any idea is an idea until it reaches the state of widespread testing. Okay, so here's an example. These are all hypothetical. But if you were to take, these are all things that could improve climate resilient agriculture or move towards it. For instance, something as simple as a major advance in increasing the efficiency with which nitrogen fertilizer is used, or reducing losses to waterways, the environment, or gaseous emissions as nitrous oxide. Now, the potential impact here is not huge. It's substantial, but not huge. Probability of success is high. With a well-funded, I'm talking about a well-funded program, national program, focused on the most important crops, cropping systems, largest nitrogen users, largest polluters, you're talking about maybe time years to start actually having whole packages of technologies ready to go, and funding requirements relatively small because there's also already a lot of work underway. Another one, expanded use of cover crops. Well, potential impact probably higher, covering the soil all the time, potential to increase carbon sequestration and reduce nutrient losses. Probability of success moderate because it's difficult sometimes to implement cover crops in wetter environments. Time frame to widespread testing, probably not long. Funding requirement moderate because in general, you're going to probably need incentives and such to get widespread adoption. Another example, nitrogen fixation on cereal crops. Well, here's an example of something that could have huge impact. Probability of success is low. I started my graduate studies at the University of California in I started a postdoc in 1980, University of California, when Ray Valentine had just moved from UC San Diego to UC Davis, specifically to get nodules on corn. This was 1980. And even then, it was only 10 years away. These are the kinds of projects I call check in the mail projects. Now, but it's an example of high, low probability, long time frame, large funding requirement. And finally, perennial grain crops is something you've heard, just a large article in the Washington Post last week about the potential here. Perennial grain crops that could replace annual grain crops like wheat. And because it's perennial, permanent cover, you don't have to replant, lots more carbon sequestration with a perennial root system. Well, here, potential impact large or moderate, probability of success again low. This has been something that's been talked about since the mid-1990s. Wes Jackson and the Land Institute were talking about this in the mid-1990s. And even now, it's another 15 to 20 years away in funding requirements like. But here's the point. And these are just kind of general guesses. I'm only examples. But the point is, we've got to get good at being able to sift kernels from chaff with regard to what can have impact in what time frame, at what cost, and what probability. We have ways of, the reason I want to focus on potential impact, because with robust metrics, we can monitor projects we're funding along the way in terms of whether they're meeting milestones in terms of time frame to widespread testing and funding requirements. If they're falling short on funding, I mean, clearly, so that you can make midterm corrections quickly for these factors But potential impact is when you have to do a good job up front. So what data are needed to estimate potential impact from adoption of improved crop and soil management technologies at scale? Well, the first one that comes to the fore is daily time step weather data. Right now, what we have are good gridded weather data sets. And you see many papers assessing the effects of climate change on yield based on these gridded weather data sets. They're not real weather, but they take real weather and they kind of cram it into grids that cover the entire terrestrial surface of the earth. We also need soil properties with greatest influence on crop and livestock yields and input requirements. And then water resource data on how much groundwater, surface water is available for crop production in areas that are irrigated, of course. By the way, if you want to read about why gridded weather data sets that have been used primarily in published studies to date on climate change effects on crop yields, take a look at a paper published in 2013 by Justin Van Wert. We also, of course, need baseline data on current crop and soil management practices. Perhaps data sets in the USDA, NAS, and ERS are sufficient to get a pretty good baseline here. So the missing piece here, I think, are weather and soil data. So under the yoke of impending climate change, high quality weather data represent an essential international public good. And there is urgent need to establish national and publicly accessible databases that are required to support sustainable intensification of crop and livestock production systems. Now, there's a danger here that I see, and this is why I'm pushing for public. This is a public good. Private, can you imagine if company X had one set of weather data to determine whether a group of farmers was moving in the right direction towards meeting climate change goals, and another company had their own proprietary set of weather data? This is kind of the way we've been going. And this, of course, I would submit the fact that Monsanto bought the Climate Court in 2014, although it hasn't really panned out yet, but it's clearly a way to go, similar to what the companies did when they bought out all the public sector maize inbred line germplasm in the 1980s and 1990s. I suggest that for climate data, this needs to stay in the public sector and publicly available. And in fact, in the face of climate change, I can see nothing more important. Let me give you an example. Here's our Corn Belt, Great Plains area. These 15 states account for 90% or more of USA maize, soybean, and wheat area and total production. And mind you, the US is the major producer of these crops worldwide. So this is a critically important agricultural domain for determining the future of our food system. How good are the weather data here? Well, here are all the weather stations, and it looks fantastic. Unfortunately, most are NOAA, National Oceanographic Atmospheric Administration stations, typically located in cities and airports. And they only record a few parameters, not all the ones we need for assessing how crops grow and how soils behave, so that we can assess impact of putative improvements in crop soil management. Underneath that is a state Mesonet system, which was specifically developed for agriculture. By the way, weather stations located in cities and airports are not good because they have a very different climate than the surrounding rural areas because of the albedo effect of structures and concrete in sucking up heat. So there is a system that was developed specifically for agricultural areas with all the required variables. Unfortunately, it's funded at the state level, and many states have cut funding. So here are all the Mesonet stations that were developed, a total of 747. Many of these are no longer active or do not have more than 15 years of daily records because states have cut funding. So here's what it looks like if you require stations that have at least 15 years of data. And you see that many states, Iowa, Indiana, Kansas, Kentucky, Ohio, Michigan, Minnesota, Missouri, South Dakota, do not have sufficient weather stations to get the robust coverage of the agricultural area that allows you to assess impact or of climate, of technologies and how they behave. 3 states do: Nebraska, Illinois, and North Dakota. Congratulations, Illinois. Now it gets worse. If you look worldwide, there are dark holes. There's black holes in terms of data quality and data availability. And of course, developing countries have the hardest time, simply because they do not have the resources at the government level to support a large network of stations. So in a world threatened by climate change, it seems to me there's a critical need for good quality, publicly available weather data. And I mean, it seems like a no-brainer. And so it has to have adequate spatial density and quality to support real-time, site-specific crop and livestock management decisions. Requires both current, that is today's weather, and long-term historical data of at least 15 years. And again, I note that the same data that could allow you to support sustainable intensification of agriculture through site-specific management, real-time decision-making, is the same data you would need to do a robust assessment of potential impact of improved technologies. I want to give you one example.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Juan Ignacio Ratalino. I am a research assistant professor at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. And today I'm going to present about a very interesting subject, which is the estimation.
What is this?
For effective privatization of agriculture.
Does anybody know what this is?
Let me start this presentation by saying.
I'm not sure. Am I still on?
Let me start this presentation by. So the approach is to estimate yield.
You're on. It sounds like possibly you have another screen open with somebody talking.
Let me look. I don't think so. But let me go back to this.
So if you look at your presenter view, there's also, it appears well, yeah, it may be something in your presenter view. I'm just not sure.
Anyway, let me go back to share. Go back to sharing. Are you back on sharing here?
We can see it if you want to click on presenter.
Yep.
Yep.
Okay.
Perfect.
I'm not sure where this is coming from. I've never had anything like this happen. Okay.
So in this figure illustrates what is the concept of yield potential.
Okay, I see it. It's notes that come along with these slides. I'm going to end here because this is these are notes underpinning these slides. I'm not sure how I can turn it off. But what I wanted to say is that
so on the left side you have yield potential.
I'm gonna end here. I'm not sure what's going on with these slides. What I'm going to do is get to my final one. I want to end here with, so I was going to give you an example of how using current gridded weather data, which is pretty much what's used in the research community right now to do impact assessment, how it leads to inaccurate assessments of that impact. And it's because of the gridded system and its imprecision. It's not precise enough to capture the dynamics of agriculture and crop production across the diversity of soils and climates. So I want to add to this list of things you might consider investing in for a circular agricultural economy and adapting, mitigating climate change. Public goods, weather, high quality weather data. It would have huge impact. Probability of success is very, very high. It's a matter of getting research stations at the minimum number of locations to get maximum coverage. And we have new spatial tools to do that very efficiently. It would take a few years, and the cost compared to other things we might consider is very small. So I want to end. Good quality, publicly accessible data on weather and soil properties with greatest influence on yields and input requirements are essential to effectively prioritize research and development investments to achieve global food security and adapt to and mitigate climate change. The bad news is that current weather and soil databases aren't up to the challenge. The good news is they could be with modest cost and in relatively short time with huge impact. And note, the same data has multiple utilities. It's also essential if you want to implement crop and soil management practices that optimize both yield and environmental performance and help accelerate technology innovation and sustainable intensification. We also need robust metrics, and I haven't had time to talk about them today, to monitor progress towards R&D investments, progress of R&D investments towards the goals of global food security, natural resource conservation, mitigation, adaptation to climate change. Potential metrics include things like carbon sequestration, reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, but here too, current methods exist, but they're too expensive and cumbersome. So we need to simplify on the far side of complexity. A bit of work to do there. We also need yield and yield stability. Now, I know many people are going to say, oh, they're always talking about yield. He's an agronomist. But think about it. Yield and yield stability are at the foundation of any kind of assessment you're going to make in terms of the future of a food system. You can turn it into profit. You can turn it into protein, micronutrients. I mean, but at the base, you've got to know the impact of a new technology on yield and yield stability. That is, especially in the face of climate change. How stable are those yields? And I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cassman. I think we all appreciate it very much. The thoughts, and I'm looking forward to having some discussion on this as we go forward. For the moment, though, we'll transition to our second presentation. I see Tony has done it in the chat, but I'll also encourage everyone, start accumulating your questions and answers, and Tony and the team will help us curate them and bring them forth so we can circle back. I'm sure the connections will start to come light between this presentation and the next. So I'm also very proud to introduce Girish Chowdhary, who's an associate professor of agricultural and biological engineering and computer science here at the University of Illinois. Dr. Chowdhary is also the Donald Bigger Willett Faculty Fellow at the University of Illinois. He's the director of the Field Robotics Engineering and Science Hub, the FRESH Lab. And he's the chief scientist of the Illinois Autonomous Farm. He's the member of the UIUC Coordinated Science Laboratory and holds affiliate appointments in aerospace and electrical engineering. Dr. Chowdhary holds a PhD from the Georgia Institute of Technology in aerospace engineering. He was a postdoc in the Laboratory for Information and Decision Systems at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and was an assistant professor at Oklahoma State University prior to joining the University of Illinois. He also worked at the German Aerospace Center Institute for Flight Systems for about 3 years. He's the author of more than 90 publications in autonomy and robotics. He's a PI on NSF, AFOSAR, NASA, ARPA-E and DOE grants, and an ONR Murray grants. He's the winner of the Air Force's Young Investigator Award and several Best Paper Awards. He's the co-founder of EarthSense Incorporated and is working towards making sustainable farming profitable with ultralight field robotics. So I think we'll be looking forward to hearing a lot about that too.
So that was a great talk by Dr. Cassman. I think I'm going to talk a little bit different. We all share the same motivations that Dr. Khanna laid out, but I'm going to talk more about the tools of how to get there, and particularly about AI and robotics. So overall, I think, kind of the technologies that we're interested in my lab and in other things that we do are really meant for terraforming, right? Of course, it'd be nice to go to Mars and terraform Mars, but I think we really need to start on Earth because, as we discussed, there's a lot of issues right now with agriculture today. And particularly, we really just seem to have lost the balance between how we're creating food and, what those agriculture practices are costing us. So about 5-6 years ago, we started working on this idea of bringing AI and robotics to try and make agriculture more sustainable and transform the way we do agriculture. So what are some of those new things, new options that we really think of them for farmers that we can add to the equation that create the right incentives for farmers so that their incentives of gaining profitability are also aligned with some of the environmental incentives. And the idea that we've been working on for a while now is this idea of robotic systems that are very different than the ones that are available today, such as the big, large autonomous tractors, and designed to fill a niche between what the equipment today can do and what we'd like to achieve. So for example, things like under-canopy phenotyping, mechanical weeding, spot side dressing, cover crop planting, and then even polycultures. And this is, a long and arduous path, and we talked about how long it takes for technologies to get through. And I think what happens with ag robotics in particular is that, people have all of these great ideas, and since the 80s, people have been talking about robots, but you still don't see them out there, and it's because farmers are hard customers, right? And that's not, that's because they're pressured on top by commodity prices and bottom by input prices. So we really need to make, when you want to give something to a farmer, it really needs to work well. So we've been thinking about what's the right path to create agricultural products that will actually make an impact in agriculture. And we kind of thought of this inverted pyramid is that it's good to start with seeds and therefore start with large breeding firms and then move slowly on to farmers, and then potentially this will drive an impact. So towards that, I'm just going to give a quick overview of one of the key systems that we've developed, and then build off of that and talk about some of the new things that we're trying to do now with iSEE. So we developed this Terra robot system, started 2018 in my lab, and then was then taken over by this company that I co-founded, and they started making field deployable robotic systems called Terra. And they were really, they serve two purposes. One is this very real need to get under-canopy phenotyping data so that we can accelerate the pace of breeding, do some things like grow shorter crop, more nitrogen efficient crop, things like that. And on the other side, they also serve the very important purpose of getting robots that actually work out there in the field and validate it over lots and lots of acreage so that we can mature the autonomy and bring solutions that are more farmer facing eventually to farmers. So the Terra robot is about 13 inches wide. It fits within the rows of corn and within 30-inch rows of corn. So here's a video of the robot driving through the corn in what we call level 1 autonomy. So it's following the rows. And it also collects data. And this is mostly visual data and some depth data. And using that data, it can do high throughput phenotyping. So for example, it was estimating the width of the corn before. Here is an example of detecting the corn ears, which can be used to detect their height. And this is a corn count algorithm that we developed. This is 3D reconstruction using the LiDAR data that comes off of these robots, which can be used for height estimation and other physiological properties. And at the end of the day, field maps like this are delivered to breeders, which include large companies, but also university breeders who can then get a lot more data, a lot more repeatable data at much lower cost than what they're getting today. And that will help accelerate the breeding pipeline. And this was in the news quite a bit a couple of years ago. There's been pretty big adopters of this technology, and the technology is maturing and going through. But what I want to talk about more today is taking some of this technology and trying to apply that to really making a difference in some of the large-scale monoculture practices that we have today. And corn and soybean, is a great place to start because it's, like Dr. Cassman was saying, it's largest in acreage. It's also the lowest in per acre profit and highest, I think, in the amount of negative impact it has. So we've heard a lot about hypoxia, nitrogen. There's things like herbicide-resistant weeds that are proliferating, and not just in the U.S. At least this graph is a little bit where you shine the torch, you get the data. So obviously, U.S. seems to be leading in these herbicide-resistant crops, but I don't know how good the data collection is in some of these other places. But it's pretty clear that these problems exist, and their costs can be pretty tremendous. So this is a number that I was told by Professor Adam Davis on what could happen if herbicide-resistant weeds really take over. And then if you go to the other side of the world, India, where I was born, I think their farms are not that big, and they're not able to afford the large-scale monoculture equipment that we have, and they end up resorting to basically manual labor exploitation. I think even then, the per acre cost of growing something in places like this can really be more than the per acre cost here in the US, and that results in a lot of, but the price is the same, right? Or if anything lesser than what the farmer can sell at. So the sustainability problems there are pretty tremendous. And I don't have any data, I'm not an agronomist to back this up, but just from my field experience, I wonder how many things are hiding under the carpet here. Overall, I mean, if you just go back to the US also, it's pretty clear that, farmers are keeping less and less of the money, especially in the commodity crops. And even though it looks like labor is reducing, the cost of labor is reducing, it's really heavily being supplemented by rising cost of inputs, which is now apparently taken over the cost of land. So I think it's important for us to think of new options that can enable different types of agricultural systems than what are enabled today. And that's why we also, it is possible to automate this large equipment. And I think the companies are in a really good place to do that. If anything, they almost have it. And primarily, I think the reasons for these not being automated are not related to technology anymore, but rather to safety, security, and insurance. But I think what we really need is different options for farmers so that they can do more regenerative things. I mean, having more rotations would be good, and eventually even polycultures. So one of the first thing that we think is a good place to start at for this is cover crops. And of course, a lot of the land in the US Midwest is basically left bare for 8 months of the year. And this land could be sequestering carbon. It could also be regenerating the soil if you have plant the correct type of cover crop. It will certainly help reduce the erosion. But today, the cost of cover crop planting is either high or there is a lot of hassle for the farmers. So if you plant cover crops during the season, when it would be a good time to plant, unlike this year when it's been pretty warm, pretty late, normally by this time it's really cold. So if you try to plant at this time cover crops, you're not going to get a good yield from them. So if you plant after harvest with seed drills. If you want to plant during the season, the options you have today are airplanes, which will waste a lot of seed because a lot of it just gets stuck in the canopy. And also it's really interesting airplanes take a lot of carbon, right? I mean, they burn a lot of fuel to fly. So I don't know what the carbon offset would be with an airplane. Or it could be these large Hagee type of tractors or sprayers, which tend to damage the crop a little bit. So 2 years ago, we started working on this idea with Professor D.K. Lee and a number of other folks on creating these little robots that could go under the canopy and plant. And this is from our last year, we planted 5 acres. This year, working with EarthSense, we've now made about 7 of these robots as prototypes. They're still prototypes. There's still a lot to be figured out, but they can carry about 120 pounds of cover crop seed, and they can go in as a team under the plant canopy. And when autonomy and everything will work, they should be able to cover 80 acres. A team of 5 robots should be able to cover 80 acres in about 5 hours. And I think what a lot of the work that we're doing right now is trying to get that AI and autonomy to that level, as well as a robot design to that level where we can get those seats in. This is just some early evidence from this year that we haven't done proper measuring yet, but it looks, at least from what we've seen, that this type of under-canopy planting is resulting in pretty good emergence. So going forward, I think the main challenge is increasing this level of autonomy of these robots so that we can get to somewhere around here, what we call level 3 autonomy, where one person can be in the field and be controlling many robots. And of course, robots can be doing cover crop planting, but the same technology then, once you get the cover crop planting figured out, can be used for mechanical weeding. It can be used for spot reseeding, for spot nitrogen applications. And then you have these new options available where the costs are low. One of the things I should have mentioned is that at level 3 autonomy, team of 5 robots can plant 80 acres in 5 hours. And our projection cost to the planting team is about $3 an acre, which is really ridiculously low compared to what you could get it with some of the larger tractors. And a lot of that is because the cost of equipment is very low. And the other part of it is even the cost of labor is reduced with humans. So if you go to level 4 autonomy, which is you don't even have to be on site, there's no reason to believe why this cost cannot even further drop. And we're looking at these analyses with Professor Khanna right now. But overall, leaving the details aside of what would make sense when, it is pretty clear that the goal should be to increase autonomy levels on one side, and then at the same time decrease the cost. So this is where agriculture will differentiate itself from things like autonomous cars, where I think I haven't seen a lot of emphasis yet, at least on reducing costs. But I think in agriculture, we'll have to be extremely robust and reduce the cost. So I think it's going to be a great cradle for some of these robotics technologies to really mature and show. So one example is this weeding. So weeding, it won't be just about the robots driving around and weeding, but it'll also be about planning on how these robots, the least team of robots, should cover the most acreage. And a part of that would be using field maps, using weather data, as well as experience to kind of guess where the weeds are going to emerge, so that you don't have these linear lawnmower type patterns, but you kind of are smarter about guessing where the largest emergence is and then trying to address those up front. And of course, there's a lot of challenges in actually doing those mechanical weeding robots. This is a very early prototype. It does show the potential of it, but this is nowhere close to production. So there's a lot of robot engineering design work that also is very exciting. And of course, the idea is to move this towards polycultures. And I really like the oasis in the Middle Eastern countries as an example, because it's a very great example of using limited resources to create a lot of production in these tiered ecosystems. So one of the new projects that we're starting with iSEE now, in collaboration with EarthSense and the Savannah Institute, is making much bigger robots. And these aren't built yet, but here's a design. That can carry up to 500 pounds of payload, and they can help do things to begin with, row crop polycultures like hazelnut and chestnut plus a cover crop type, but then eventually more into the more advanced or more decentralized, smaller sets of polycultures. So this is an exciting thing that we're really excited about, how some of these technologies could pan out into the future. And eventually the idea is, of course, to decentralize the producing system so that there's a lot more local gardening, there's a lot more productive local gardening. And for that, the idea is to create better robotic manipulator platforms that are not only highly dexterous, but can also be deployed at large scale. And here we're working with Professor Krishnan and a number of folks at the AI Institute at Illinois to create these robots that can basically have some very low cost manipulators. So like this is a 3D printed arm that is soft and can bend and do all kinds of things and has a 3D printed grasper. All of this shouldn't cost any more than $20. And these are just a simple arms that go on a 3D printed robot. And the idea is this can add some more dexterity in more free form type of agriculture like home gardens or polycultures. So that's kind of where we're going in terms of creating some of these tools. A big thank you to iSEE for funding our cover crop project on creating this iPlaces living lab, where we're planting cover crops and we're going to do some experiments with grazing on them, and then also the chestnut, the hazelnut, the chestnut harvester robot with the Savannah Institute, which was founded by Kevin Woltz, who came also out of the university, to make polycultures more promising. So I'll just stop here, and of course, all of this is done by this set of amazing grad students and postdocs at the university.
I'll encourage some questions for the Q&A, and that would help. I would love to hear from the audience in some of those areas of interest. One common thread that I might inspire some discussion on both sides is this notion that we have technology and opportunity, maybe even readily available in the developed world, but bigger gaps in the developing worlds. And I wonder if, I always like to push this notion of, it would be great to fill those gaps. Yeah. But I'd also like to see us even thinking about considering that none of these, neither the data that Ken was referring to, nor the technology that Girish was describing, why not even leapfrog what's happening in the developed world, in the developing world? And I'm sure you've both thought of this in certain fashions. Where are the real opportunities to do so? So I wonder if we can envision how this might be the data you were seeking might be acquired in Africa and in Girish, maybe places where the small robotics could be applied in and around developing parts of the world, as in India, for example.
Yeah. I mean, I think the idea with the small robots has always been that they could be lower cost, and small robots for small farms has also been an idea and underlying foundational, actually, inspiration for a lot of this work. And this notion of scale neutrality of technology is very important. So today, technology only scales up in agriculture, right? So you have to have a big, large farm to pay off the large tractor that you need to offset the labor. In small farms, you're kind of out of luck because you won't have enough revenue to pay off the tractor. So people have tried things like cooperative tractor ownership, and those are to some level successful. But I think there is also room in creating new equipment for places like India and Africa that just appropriate scale, and they're mechanized and they're automated to a large extent, so that because even there, it's the same thing in India, right? I mean, the farmers' population is aging. Most of the young generation want to go work in the cities where they earn more money. Cities are overcrowded, overpopulated, and horrible places to live, and rural areas don't have a lot of facilities. So I think autonomy even there is going to be important, even though it looks like people should just be doing more of that labor. I think the reality is very different over there.
Right. And I would say, Luis, that we can leapfrog in the sense of getting the essential data on climate and soils, because we've done a large body of work recently under the Yield Gap Atlas that specifically asks the question, in developing countries, what is the minimum number of locations that you need to get real data, real weather data, real data on soils and cropping systems, such that you can robustly estimate yields and yield gaps in those countries. And if you add another location, it makes no difference on the estimate at the national level. And that question really hasn't been asked before. And after a lot of work, it turns out the number is not large. So for all of Nigeria, it might only be 50 locations. So it becomes a tractable problem, Luis, in a way that you saw that first slide I showed with all the weather stations. Well, that's just throwing, darts at the map. In this case, you would identify those locations that are relevant to the largest amount of crop area in each country, and continue adding locations like that until you get coverage that we've shown you only need 40 to 50% coverage of crop area. And the other side is that farmers grow crops in areas they're most adapted to, right? Why would you do otherwise? So crops seek out certain environments like heat-seeking missiles, which is good because it means you can have a relatively few locations to cover and most of these areas are flat. Not all agricultural areas, but a lot of the bread baskets are relatively flat topographies, so that one weather station can cover a fair amount of area. And the question is, what is the minimum? We answer that. It's not large, so it becomes very feasible for all countries to cover their important agricultural areas and get the needed data.
Ken, let me continue with you for a moment. I think we have to look at it as potentially worrying, where many of these data stations are being, should I say, abandoned, given up on. Do you have any comments regarding what might have been the intrinsic value that was not appreciated as the people paying for those data stations were removing their investments?
Right. Well, of course, the attrition largely occurred in the 1990s, early 2000s, when we had a whole round. You're a young man, Luis, but if you were at the university back in those days, colleges of agriculture were cutting positions, cutting staff. They were looking at how they ran their farms, because it was a fixed cost, right? In a smaller budget. State funding was dropping. You were forced to rely more on external funding, right? And that's still going on. Whereas these stations are funded at the state level in hard dollar state budgets. And it just became something that, unless there was a large clamor, it was easy to cut. And I think the problem is that now it becomes an enabling data set for emerging technologies, the type that Girish is talking about. I mean, he may need for those kinds of robots data on soil properties or microclimates, within the canopy to be able to know where to look even. And so having these data also depended on the demand. And I think the demand now is huge. Now, the question is, should it be provided by the private sector or the public sector? I think that's a fundamental issue.
So Girish, if I shift the attention back to you, it is tremendously exciting to see the new activity and investment in not just the small robotics in general, data in general, with regards to food and agriculture. And you're in an interesting position where you're crossing both the public and the private sector. I have to suspect, though, that some of even the data that Ken's describing is still a major obstacle for what you might be trying to achieve. Can you describe that obstacle or others that might be of interest for us as we try to position ourselves for the future?
Yeah, I think from the data perspective, I think we're still fighting in the trenches, right? To really think of the large level optimization of all of this, and that's where I think a lot of this will come into play. Now you have robots deployed here and there. What exactly is the impact? Are we reducing costs? Are we deploying them optimally? Are we getting the right type of data? So, I don't have much maybe to say on that, on that front, but I do have some things to say about the public-private relationship. Because I think what we have done really well, I feel, in the agriculture universities, and what USDA is doing really well, what NSF is doing well, ARPA-E, DOE, is they're investing in technologies at the university. They're helping researchers like me or like those who are on our AI Farm National Institute, CDA, iSEE, to create new technologies. But what is probably not really given a lot of attention at is how is that going to make an impact on the farmers' lives, right? So, in other industries which are more dynamic, it's often the case that sometimes the industry is, if not on par, but ahead in research with respect to the universities. They are really eager to grab technology from the university. There's a lot more open source publication, like all kinds of different things where facilitate like new ideas from the university make it into the final products, right? If you look at iPhones and all those types of technologies that we have seen. In agriculture, there's a pretty big gap right now between where, the large companies, their incentives are maximize their current business, and they're doing a great job of making money, right? And I think these new technologies don't necessarily fit into that. And it's also a lot of hardware involved, and hardware is always hard. So I feel like one of the things that maybe like, and the NSF SBIR does it a little bit, ARPA ESBR does it a little bit, but this middle gap here is still there, where this valley of death, what we call in the world of entrepreneurship, where great ideas come to die, honestly. I mean, like they need to be walked through here so that they can scale and go ahead. And what is very reassuring to me with my experience at EarthSense is seeing a lot of new venture capital funds that are specifically focusing on just exactly what Ken was saying, like private sector stepping up and saying, look, this is important. We all need to live here. Our kids need to live here after we're done. So it's not just about making money anymore. It's about how do we heal the planet? How do we, make a better society? So I feel it's very promising that that's happening, but we need more voices like Ken's and like iSEE to really bring that to attention so that private sector will invest more in these regenerative techniques.
If I could just jump in with a question, Ken and Girish, thanks for the talks. Ken, while I totally agree with you on the need for more data, but, there's also the question of whether we have the capability to use that data to really improve decision-making. And there's a whole set of issues, particularly, you mentioned nitrogen management as being one where there could be high impact, but where do you think we are on that? And what is sort of holding us back from being able to improve nitrogen management?
Right. Okay. Well, I guess first off, the data that I'm talking about are data that can be easily used within current technologies and modeling capacities, decision-making processes. With nitrogen per se, there are a number of technologies that help, but each of them at the margin and a small amount. And so it's bringing them together. All the way, you've heard of the 4 R's of nutrient management: the right time, right place, right amount, right form. But there are also bigger things like crop rotations, cover crops, at another level that attack the problem. And another level above that is to know enough to know which parts of your field are the leakiest. And you'll find that in general, they're also the lowest yielding. And you'll find in many cases that if you were to just estimate the profits from those parts of your field, it's negative most years. So the final level is if we were to take out 2-3% of the most vulnerable land, you would also have huge impact. So I guess my best answer for you is that we have lots of technologies on the shelf that will need to come together and at these different levels in terms of the in-season decisions, the more strategic about how much, rate, time, form, etc., the crop rotations, the cover crops, and the retirement of land. Taken together, Madhu, I think that it's very promising if there is sufficient incentives for growers to adopt.
Yep.
But there's no one magic bullet at all.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you both very, very much. We are at the top of the hour again, so I think at this time I'll begin closing our first session for iSEE. Thank you so much to you both in these very informative talks. I remain very excited to have brilliant people working on these challenging problems that are going to impact all our futures. I also remain highly motivated to keep digging in, because that's what we need to do. We need to keep digging into solving the biggest of the grand challenges. So thanks to everyone for attending and continuing to attend here and now. Our next Congress, our next session within the Congress will be continuing our discussion on the circular economy. It's scheduled at 1 p.m. Central Time next Wednesday, October 27th. I hope you can join us again at that time. And with that, I'll let you all go.